to welcome you today to Molly Hayes Martin's thesis defense. It's been a real pleasure to have Molly in the lab, and you can see that by the representation of the lab here. She's really been a great lab member and involved in lots of the projects in the lab and around campus. She's accomplished an amazing amount in the short time that she's here, and I think you'll be really impressed with the work she's done up in Napa and Sonoma. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Molly.
Perfect, thanks.
I was going to say the normal thing. She did her undergraduate degree at Whitman College and came directly here after that.
Great. So welcome and thank you for coming. I'm going to be presenting on my thesis research, which is predicting resilience of plant pollinator communities. And this is a study focused on how plant and pollinator communities change following disturbance and how we can predict their resilience to disturbance. So disturbance occurs in essentially all ecosystems on Earth. And while it's part of healthy functioning systems, humans have introduced new types of disturbance and have also changed the frequency and scale of naturally occurring disturbances. And fire is an example of a disturbance that can completely reshape ecosystems, and it benefits some organisms while harming others. Another example of a natural disturbance is flooding. And flooding can drive out organisms that rely on terrestrial habitats, but can benefit other organisms by providing necessary resources. And in more mountainous ecosystems, avalanches can cause a major disturbance. Similarly, landslides can clear large areas and leave little besides rocks and dirt. And then some examples of human-caused disturbances include clear cutting, grazing, and mowing. And along with mowing, a lot of ecosystems have been changed by agricultural expansion, and an example of that is just in our neighborhood in Napa and Sonoma counties, where vineyards have expanded into what used to be natural oak woodland. So I want to go back to fire, both because fire is a particularly relevant example in California right now, since we've had some really large-scale fires over the last few years, and also because it's an example of a natural disturbance that humans have hugely impacted. So fires are part of healthy systems, but climate change has resulted in hotter, drier, longer summers, which have led to more frequent, larger, and more destructive fires, along with fire suppression for years has ended up in this. So given that humans have changed the frequency and severity of natural disturbances and also created new types of disturbances, ecologists ask two central questions. One, how does disturbance shape ecological communities? And two, what predicts how resilient a community will be to disturbance? And here, ecological resilience refers to the ability of an ecosystem to recover quickly following a disturbance. And the tools available to answer these questions have changed over the years, and they've borrowed from a variety of disciplines, including engineering, economics, and technology. And the study of ecological resilience began as early as the 1800s with Charles Darwin, and it's continued to be a key question in how community and population ecology works. And understanding what causes ecological resilience helps scientists learn about the rise and fall of different species in the past and also to plan for the future. And it's also central to endangered species management and understanding what happens to communities when you lose species. So two opposing theories on what leads to resilience have been suggested. First, that high diversity within an ecosystem leads to resilience, and that's because organisms respond to disturbance in varied ways. So ecosystem function is more likely to remain intact following a disturbance than in a system with low diversity. And an example of an ecosystem with high diversity is a rainforest. And the second theory is that low diversity leads to resilience. And that's because it's easier to maintain an equilibrium state with fewer species, is the theory. And this theory suggests that there's more flexibility in systems with fewer species, and that flexibility leads to resilience. And an example of an ecosystem with low diversity, relatively low diversity, is a salt marsh. So the current consensus is more or less that more diverse communities lead to higher stability or resilience. Which brings us to these three guys. So on the left is Charles Elton, and he was an English zoologist, an animal ecologist who began his work in the 1920s. In the middle is Robert MacArthur, and he was a Canadian-born American ecologist who worked during the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And then on the right is Robert May, and he was an Australian scientist who was a collaborator of MacArthur's. And Elton, MacArthur, and May all studied community and population ecology, and they tried to answer the central question of what makes an ecosystem resilient to something like disturbance. And through their work, both Elton and MacArthur concluded that diversity leads to stability. And May was collaborating with MacArthur on that work, but he later went on to kind of change his mind, and he later showed that communities with low diversity lead to more resilience because they're more able to remain in an equilibrium state than more complicated systems with more species. And these multiple perspectives on what makes an ecosystem resilient indicates that the debate is ongoing and that factors influencing resilience may differ between different systems. So one way to measure the structure of interactions between groups of organisms and to see how that structure changes after something like disturbance is through analyzing networks. So in the most simple example, which is a bipartite network, like you see here, you have two groups of interacting organisms. So on the top are bee species, and the number of these black rectangles show us the number of different species, and then the width shows the relative abundance of that species compared to the other species in the system. And then we have plant species down here, and the connecting bars show how often each bee species is visiting each plant species, with the width showing the frequency of those visits. So it's a little hard to see the shading, but this is a wide bar here, and then these are like narrower bars that are happening less frequently. And network theory can be used to look at more complicated networks like food webs. So there are a variety of ways to measure a network, and I'm just going to introduce you to a few of the more commonly used ones that we can use to look at a network and then see how it changes after disturbance. So first is generality, and that's a measure of how many interactions there are in a community. So for example, let's take a look at this very simplified ecosystem with things that eat on the top and things that are eaten on the bottom. And blue whales definitely don't eat squid, but I don't think there are any marine biologists here, so we're not going to worry about that. So we can say the system's generalized if the whale and penguin both eat krill and shrimp, like on the left. Well, it's specialized if the whale only eats krill and the penguin only eats squid on the right. So now let's pretend there's an oil spill and all the krill die. So the generalized system on the left will be more resilient because that whale can switch to eating the squid. While in specialized system, the whale won't have anything to eat because it only eats krill. So based on this, we expect more generalized systems to be more resilient to disturbance. And here's an example of what generality looks like in a bipartite network. So again, you have one set of species on the top and one on the bottom, and then the line showing how they're interacting. So generalized on the left, and this is the extreme example where the species on the top are visiting every single possible species, and on the right, they're only visiting one. So the next metric is nestedness, and I'm going to use a variety of bee and plant species to explain this. On the left is a bumblebee, which is known to be a generalist and visits a wide variety of plant species. And on the right is a bee species that only specializes on cacti. And then the rest of these bee species are ordered from generalists on the left to specialists on the right. And we expect a community with a nested structure to be more resilient to disturbance than one that has a more random pattern of interactions because nestedness creates redundancy. So for the most part, if one bee or plant species is removed from the system, it's redundant enough that the community structure will remain somewhat unchanged. So here's what a nested network looks like on the left. And then on the right is a non-nested network, so it's more or less random interactions. All right, so for the next one, connectants, we're going to go back to the whale penguin example. But now we're looking at the number of connections between that top level and the bottom level. So on the left, there are 4 connections out of a total of 4 possible connections between the 2 levels. And on the right, there are only 2 connections out of a total of 4 possible connections. So theory suggests that the more connected network will be more resilient to disturbance. And here's what connectance looks like in a network example. And this should look familiar since these are the exact same networks that we use to look at generality. So this is getting at the same thing, but measuring a different part of the network. And then to explain modularity, we need to add a few more creatures to this example. So now we're going to have an elephant seal, leopard seal, crab, and fish. And now I'm getting even less correct about what eats what, but don't worry about that. So in the system on the left, the 2 levels are interacting somewhat randomly. But in the system on the right, there are 2 distinct groupings or modules of interactions. And because the system without the modules is more connected and more generalized, we expect it to be more resilient to disturbance than this more modular example. And here's what modularity looks like in a network with low modularity, so a more random pattern of interactions on the left, and high modularity here on the right with 3 separate modules. So now that we've talked about how we can measure the structure of interactions within a community and touched on the theory behind what makes an ecosystem resilient, I want to shift gears and talk a little bit more about the local scale. So last fall, my advisor Gretchen and I were talking about what I wanted to focus my research on. And we're talking about how in the early 2000s, Gretchen and some of her students did a study of vineyard expansion in Napa and Sonoma counties. And they were looking at how vineyard expansion reshapes bee communities, plant communities, and the ways that they interact. And as we were considering resampling the same sites and just seeing how they've changed over the past 15 or 16 years since that original study, a complex of wildfires started in the North Bay, right where those sites were. And they ended up burning almost exactly half of those original study sites, which set up a perfect before or after control impact design for us to look at how fire was impacting these communities. And we had the control to see how they changed over time and the impact to see the impact of the fire. So here's a map of the fires from the fall of 2017. And we're kind of focusing on these 2 here. Here's Napa, just to orient you, the town of Napa, and this is the Napa Valley running north, and Sonoma over here with the Sonoma Valley running north. So San Francisco's down below the screen. So we use the fires as a way to study how disturbance impacts the structure of interactions within an ecosystem. And we focused on 3 central questions. First, how does fire change network structure? 2, how does fire impact plant and bee communities separately? And 3, what predicts resilience? And because the time frame between the fires happening and us needing to begin research was really short, we didn't have time to apply for traditional grants, so we ended up doing something a little unusual and used the crowdsourcing site experiment.com to raise money for the study. And it turned out to be really successful and was a fun way to involve a bunch of people. And we're actually filming today so we can show it to all of the people who donated to make the project happen. So back to the map of the fires. Our study sites were distributed throughout Napa and Sonoma counties with 4 burned sites and 4 unburned sites. Yeah, so this is a zoomed in version of that map. The burn sites are the red circles, so we have 1 here, and 2 right here. And then unburned sites are the blue triangles, so do one up here and the other one's over here. So you can see they're pretty spread out. Yeah. And because 4 sites burned and 4 didn't burn, we were able to isolate the impact of fire through using the before-after control impact study that I talked about. So here's what that study design looks like. We had 2 before years because Gretchen had sampled in 2002 and 2003, and then 1 after year in 2018. And 8 sites total, 4 of which burned and 4 didn't burn. And most studies looking at the impact of disturbance compare sites, different sites at the same time, but rather than comparing like one site before disturbance and then it's disturbed and after disturbance, mostly because it's hard to predict whether something's going to be disturbed or not. So it's hard to get that before data. And being able to sample the same site over time is the strongest study design for isolating the changes. And also because Gretchen collected data in both 2002 and 2003, we decided to do 2 sets of analyses, one with 2002 as the baseline compared to 2018 and one with 2003. So the sites were all located in oak woodland with some varying from more open canopied to closed canopied. Some had open field areas. Some sites were near vineyards and others were in more natural oak woodlands. And also the fire severity differed between the sites. And I sampled entirely using hand netting following the protocol from the original study. I visited each site approximately once every 2 weeks and sampled for 2 hours. And once I got to a site, I would walk through the whole thing, collecting all the bees that I saw. And I'd spend no more than 5 minutes on a certain plant before moving on, and then I'd come back if I'd walked through the whole site, and I'd come back to the areas that had the most bees. And I also only sampled on warm, calm, sunny days to minimize differences due to weather, which is why bee sampling is probably the best research. It's all warm and beautiful. And I collected bees regardless of whether they were on plants, on the ground, or flying. And I kept track of what plant I would collect a bee on so that I could construct those plant pollinator networks later on. And then I identified them, had them identified, I didn't personally identify most of them, to the lowest taxonomic level, and that was species for most of them, but a few could only be identified to genus or subgenus. So here's a picture of all the bees that I caught. Got a little cropped at the top and bottom. But we caught a total of 801 bees this past summer from 82 different species. And I also collected voucher specimens for all the flowering plants and pressed them and then identified them all to species. So bee populations can fluctuate significantly between years based on different factors, but one of the main ones is weather. So I compared minimum temperature, maximum temperature, and precipitation between that 2002 year, 2003, and 2018. So here on the left, I think it got cut off, but that is the minimum temperature by month, then maximum, and then precipitation. So red is the 2001 to 2002 growing season, green is 2002 to 3, and blue is 17, 18. So as you can see, 2017 to 18 was slightly cooler and drier than both 2002 and 2003, but it didn't seem huge, so I didn't expect it to have a really significant difference. But even though the weather was fairly similar in 2002 and 2003, in that original study, they collected different abundances and species richness values at those different sites, so I decided to do 2 sets of analyses to take into account the differences in those years. So we'll begin by exploring the first question, which is how does disturbance change network structure? And in order to answer this question, I started by using the bipartite package in the R statistical package to construct networks. So here's an example of networks at a single site with before fire on the left and after fire on the right. And then using that same package, the bipartite package, I pulled out the values for network metrics for each of the sites. And then I isolated how the metrics changed due to fire using that before-after control impact design, which involves kind of a modified t-test. So here are the networks from the 4 unburned sites comparing before, so 2003 to after on the bottom, 2018. And these are comparing the same sites across time. And I just want you to look at these networks and see that they look different between before and after. So the number and width of those bars indicating species has changed, and also the width and number of connecting lines is different. These are the networks from the 4 sites that burned. So again, this is 2003 with before on the top and after on the bottom. And again, just look at the networks from 2003 and compare them to the ones from 2018. So you can see that they look quite different, right? Even for burned, but also for unburned. So what this is telling us is that those networks changed a lot over time, regardless of whether they burned or didn't burn, since we're seeing quite a bit of difference. So next we'll look at how the network metrics I introduced at the beginning, so those were generality, connectance, nestedness, and modularity, how those changed once we controlled for this change that we saw across time at all of the sites. And since the results from 2002 and 2003 were similar, although not always significant, I'm just going to show you the results from 2003, so you're not here all day. So I'm going to start by orienting you to the graphs that I use to show pretty much all of my results. So on the left are 2 graphs showing what we expected to find. So the left-hand side of those 2 graphs shows control sites. I'll come point. Get over my pile of cords. So these are the control sites with before on the left and after on the right, and then burned sites before or after. And the lines are showing the different sites. So that's just to give you an idea that there are differences between sites. And that variability could be due to like how the site was managed, habitat, different weather at the sites. But what I really want you to look at are these box plots. So the box plots, the middle line is the mean value. The bottom is the first quartile and the top is the third quartile. So it gives you an idea of the mean, but also how much variability there is in the data. So for each test, I have expected on the left and then what I actually found on the right. So I want you to look at the means on the left and how those change, and then the means on the right. And that's going to tell you if we found what we expected to find or not. So for bee abundance, we expected to find higher bee abundance in burned areas compared to unburned areas. And that's mostly because fire creates conditions where annual plant species that are easily accessible to bees do really well. So while we didn't find the difference that we expected, it looks like there were really significant declines across both the unburned sites on the left and these burned sites on the right. And when you plot bee abundance at all sites on a single graph, you can see that there are really significant declines in bee abundance over time. So we have 2002 as the baseline year on the left and 2003 on the right. So we found huge declines in bee abundance, with 67% decline since 2002 and 50% since 2003. And I expected to see some differences due to like annual fluctuation in weather, but this was really drastic and not what I expected to find. So these are the results for bee species richness, which is a measure of how many different species of bees we found at each site. And this just tells us about the numbers, not the species. So if we found 20 species at one site, it could be 20 completely different species than we found at a different site. So take a minute and look at those expected graph means, and then look at the means of what we found. So similarly to bee abundance, we expected to see an increase in bee species richness following fire. And we didn't find that increase, but again, we found declines in bee species richness across both types of sites. So when all sites are combined, you can see big declines with 16% decline since 2002, but you can see there's a pretty big p-value on that. But you also have to take into account that we had a very small sample size since we're limited by how many sites were in that original study. And then since 2003, there was a 32% decline, and that's a very significant result with a p of 0.01. So like bee abundance and species richness, we expected to find an increase in plant species richness after fire due to an increase in the availability of nutrients, increase in niche space, and there's a whole category of plants known as fire followers that you'll only find in the years following fire. And we didn't find the increase in plant species richness at burn sites that we expected, but we did find, again, that decline across all sites. So you can see there's a decline of 11% since 2002, but with a very large p-value, and then a decline of 25% since 2003. So now we're going to look at how the network metrics changed following fire. There's a significant increase in generality at burned sites, and this doesn't look exactly like the expected, and that's because at control sites, there's a decline in generality. So you kind of have to pretend that you take those means on the control side and bump them up so they're even, and then bump up the one on the impact side too, because that's how we're controlling for the changes. So then there is an increase in bee generality, even though just looking at this graph, it doesn't necessarily look that way. And we expected to see an increase in nestedness at burn sites, but we found no significant change in nestedness. And as expected, there was a significant decline in modularity following fire. And again, you kind of have to pretend that you're bumping down both sides because of that change in the control site. And we also found that when weighted, connectance was higher at burn sites compared to unburned sites. This is one of my favorites. It looks just like the expected one, which is always exciting. All right, so now that we've talked about the results of how fire changes network structure, we're going to move on to the second question, which is how does fire impact plant and bee community composition? So to look at the changes in bee species composition, I use non-metric multidimensional scaling, or NMDS, and it's a technique used to represent communities in multidimensional space. So for example, you can plot the abundance of a single species in a community on one axis. Then you add a second axis, add a second species, third axis, third species, and so on until you've plotted all of the species. And then NMDS, essentially, probably statisticians would not want me to say this, but my understanding is that it kind of squishes all of those axes together and then tells you what are the two most representative measures of the community in multidimensional space. So these are the results of the NMDS with 2002 on the left and 2003 on the right. And so you can see that we have, this is before at the control sites, before at the burn sites, and then after burned, after control. So you can see that the before sites, whether they were burned or not, are overlapping, and that makes sense because they weren't burned at that point. These were just a bunch of fairly similar sites. But you can see that there's quite a bit of difference between those before sites and the after sites, which makes us think that the community composition of the bee community has changed over time, but also the after sites are pretty different. So there have also been changes due to fire. And the next analysis that we plan to do is look at what specific families and genera have changed the most, because this is just telling us they're different, but not how are they different. So in addition to looking at how species composition changed, I wanted to look at how some of the traits of the plant and bee communities changed following fire. So within the plant community, I looked at the percent of annual versus perennial plants, native versus non-native plants, and invasive versus non-invasive plants. And because fire increases the flow of available nutrients, fire is generally followed by a flush of annual plants. So I expected to see increased annual plants following fire. And there isn't that much data on how fire impacts natives and invasives, so I didn't really know what to expect and didn't expect to see many significant changes. So in terms of the bee species, I expected to see an increase in the percent of bees that nested below ground. And that's because during the fire season, bees are generally in their nests, and if they're nested below ground, they'll be better insulated from fire than if they're above ground in like cavities and stems and things like that. And then I also expected to see an increase in the percent of bees that are classified as generalists. So again, we have the expected on the left and what we found on the right. And we surprisingly found no differences in the percent of ground nesting bees at burned and unburned sites. And you can see there's quite a bit of variability in this data. And this could be a result of the low fire intensity, or it could be telling us that the fires were quite patchy. And we couldn't consider those things in the study since we had such a small sample size. But we did find the increase in generalist bees at burned sites that we expected. And our results of increased generalist bee species at burned sites was interesting, considering we didn't see the differences in annual plant species that we expected would be causing those increases in generalist bees. And again, there's quite a bit of variability in this data. And we didn't expect to find much difference in the percent of native species, but we ended up finding a decrease across all sites. So there are fewer natives and more non-natives than there were at that original study. And also, we didn't expect to see huge differences in the percent of species that are invasives, but we found an increase in invasives across all sites. So finally, I tested whether baseline values of network metrics predict resilience through using regressions. So I plotted the initial value of network metrics from just the 4 burned sites as the predictor, and then the change in abundance and species richness of the bee community as the response. And since I only had 4 sites for this, since I was only using burned, this was a really small sample size. So here the graph on the left is showing what we expected, with the before values on the x-axis, and then the change between before and after on the y-axis. And the less change, the more resilient. So think of resilience as being at the bottom, the lower end of the y-axis. So for bee abundance, we expected that high initial abundance would lead to high resilience, and that low initial abundance would lead to low resilience. And that was pretty much exactly what we found. So the more bee species, or the more number of bees in a community, the more resilient it will be. And then for bee species richness, so the number of species, we expected the same thing, that high species richness to begin with would lead to more resilience. And again, that's exactly what we found. So for plant species richness, we found the same pattern, that higher initial richness led to higher resilience. And while we expected that high generality would also lead to higher resilience, we found essentially no relationship there. And we expected that nested sites would be more resilient. And there was kind of a weak connection there, but this data is so variable that there's not a strong relationship between nestedness and resilience. And similarly, we thought that higher connectance would lead to higher resilience, and we did find that for weighted connectance, that relationship was true. And then unlike the other metrics, we expected that low modularity would lead to higher resilience. And we found only a weak relationship, again, with pretty variable data. So when we take a step back and look at these results, we can draw a few conclusions. We found that network structure changed essentially as we expected that it would following fire. And we found increases in generality and connectance and decreases in modularity. And then surprisingly, we found no change in bee abundance, bee species richness, or plant species richness as a result of fire, but we did see those big declines over all sites. And we found that the plant species composition of the bee community changed significantly between both over time, but also as a result of burning. And these changes reflect an increase in generalist species, bee species, which is what we expected. But we found no change in the annual plant species or the percent of ground nesting bees following fire. And some possible explanations for not finding those changes that we expected were, one, the fire was patchy and it moved at varying speeds at varying temperatures, which is true of all fires. Two, our results are affected by bees moving in from surrounding reservoir habitats, which bees are known to forage quite a ways from their nests, so that's pretty possible. And finally, some larger landscape trend is causing us not to see these changes as a result of fire that we would expect. So they're kind of being overshadowed by something else going on. So for this one, if you're a good predictor, you get a gold star. And abundance and species richness appear to be the best predictors. And the network structure doesn't seem to predict resilience very well at all. It's really the abundance and richness that are the best predictors. And this suggests that increasing abundance and richness is the best way to increase resilience at a site. So from these conclusions, two clear messages come through. First, overall bee numbers and the number of species have dropped dramatically over the past 15 or 16 years since that original study. And that may be overpowering the changes due to fire that we were expecting. And these declines are similar to insect declines that we're seeing around the world, and I'm sure you've all read about. And they're also surprising because they're happening in areas that aren't experiencing significant landscape change, which is where you might expect to see these big declines. And the second message is that the best predictors of resilience are abundance and species richness. And so that's really scary if you step back and think about this, that the best predictors are abundance and species richness, and we're seeing huge declines in abundance and species richness across all sites. So this could create a feedback loop and eventually end up in some sort of extinction vortex where we're losing species because we're getting less and less resilient. And fortunately, now I'm going to end on a good note since that's a little depressing to go home with that and this nice picture. So fortunately, our understanding of what factors support resilience within ecological communities is continuing to grow, and people continue to study this. And we have the knowledge and tools necessary to slow, if not reverse, these declines. It's just going to take a whole lot of coordination between scientists, policymakers, and land managers. So finally, I'd like to thank everybody who helped make this research possible, including Dr. Gretchen Laboon and Dr. Ed Connor here at San Francisco State, and also Dr. Diego Vasquez, who's in the computer over here, and is at the University of Mendoza in Argentina. Also, thank you to my great volunteers, some of whom are here, who went out and collected data with me in the field. Also, our generous landowners who let us sample on their property, and then all the people who donated to make this research possible. And thank you to all of you guys for coming here and hearing what my research was about and what I found. And so I'll leave you with this photo. It's an Osmia species or a bee in the genus Osmia that I caught as part of the research, and Nevin took a picture of. And he also took the first photo and the one right before this. And that's my last slide. So thank you. If you have any questions, I'll take them.